To a degree, any movie is going to be subjective in the way its audience views it. Meaning, everybody will have their own thoughts and opinions on it, regardless of how objectively good or bad it actually is. And this only applies even more so to comedy movies. As is already widely known, what's considered absolutely hilarious to one person may seem totally unfunny to somebody else. And as a result, the general reception of most comedy films will usually end up somewhat skewed, as everybody's enjoyment of it is a lot more likely to vary wildly from person to person. But that being said, I've noticed a trend in recent years in most comedy movies, specifically that they've been leaning a lot more into black comedy and gross out type humor. And while there's nothing wrong with that, as again, you're free to find anything funny that you want to, I just think that it's gotten a little overly excessive. And a few spoilers may abound for some of the movies I bring up, so if there's something you've been meaning to see but haven't yet, you should probably click off this video and come back to it another day. There will be no other spoiler warnings in this video. Alright. So let me just start out by clarifying here that this video is not just an attack on black comedy in general. Because I'll be the first person to admit it. Black comedy can be pretty dang funny when put into the right context. Besides, you can even find forms of it in children's cartoons, so there is most definitely a time and place for it. I'm just simply trying to argue that this particular brand of humor is being way too overused these days, to the point that it feels like virtually every comedy out there either relies almost solely on black humor or R-rated one-liners you could easily find in an influencer's video. Case in point, take 2012's Silver Linings Playbook. Now once again, I'll be the first person to say that this movie is actually a pretty good one. Even its ability to mix comedy with the more serious subject matter is rather impressive, and I will give it proper credit for that. However, I just feel that it's trying a little too hard to be edgy at times. I mean, if somebody thinks they have bad communication problems, all they need to do is watch Bradley Cooper's character to give them a confidence boost. Seriously, this man's social skills are terrible. And not to mention, there's a whole running gag made out of the fact that he keeps reminding Tiffany of the fact that her husband is dead, to the point that she even asks him to stop. And again, it's pretty funny, but at the same time, is it really in the best taste? Even if the joke is meant to be at his expense? And even the whole thing about trying to make a comedy around mental illness. Once again, I get it. The writers didn't want the movie to be dead serious and wanted to throw in some levity. But wouldn't some argue that mental illness, especially in this day and age, is a topic that maybe should be handled a bit more delicately? Now in the end, this movie manages to pull it off pretty well, but do you know how easily it could have messed that up? And not to mention, it may be funny, but one still has to admit it gets pretty darn black at times. Or to use another example of this, take Ghostbusters Afterlife. Though let me once again please note here first that this is a movie I hold in pretty high regard, to the point that I even did something of a review on it that you can find a link in the description too. Now many have called this movie a quote-unquote soft reboot of the original Ghostbusters, and I will admit, I can see the similarities. But one place where it very much differs from the original is in its style of humor. To put it simply, in the original, most of the humor comes from placing some of the best and most talented comedians of the era in one room together, along with a great script written by two of those comedians. So at the end of the day, the main source of humor comes from the characters directly, especially Bill Murray's character, usually in reaction to all the ghostly hijinks that are going on. Sure, there is some outside comedy, but it's all pretty light, at least until Gozer shows up. Then the humor gets a little more desperate. In Ghostbusters Afterlife, however, while it does still contain quite a bit of that original Ghostbusters humor, especially when the old team arrives, most of the comedy is noticeably blacker. Seriously, I don't know if there's a single joke that comes out of Carrie Coon's mouth that isn't as black as coffee, and even about half of the lines Phoebe has don't exactly add any sugar to that. Really, if there's any character outside of the original trio that comes even remotely close to emulating the first movie's lighter brand of humor, it's Paul Rudd's character. And even then, he has quite a few dark jokes handed to him as well. Now, once again, I'm not trying to argue that this is necessarily a bad thing, just that it can kind of get the audience down after a while. But at the same time, these types of humor also reflect what both movies were intended to be. Because Ghostbusters was supposed to be a supernatural film that wasn't afraid to take itself seriously, but also had plenty of levity and ultimately just wanted to entertain the audience. Ghostbusters Afterlife, however, is honestly a much more serious movie, leaning a lot more into drama and scares, and the much blacker comedy is meant to reflect that. Now, part of this may very well be down to the fact that the movie is serving as a tribute to Harold Ramis, and thus the more somber tone is appropriate, and that may very well be true. But the fact still remains that a lot of the humor that is present wouldn't be out of place in any other movie of its time. I mean, just compare the two possession scenes to each other. In the original, it ends up pretty funny because of Bill Murray's absolutely perfect deadpan reaction to it. In Ghostbusters Afterlife, the scene is played dead straight, almost feeling like something out of a horror movie. Basically, these two movies perfectly reflect the era they were made in. Ghostbusters was an 80s style supernatural comedy that ultimately just wanted to give the audience a good time, while in Ghostbusters Afterlife, it's a lot more about making the audience feel what the writers want you to feel. Now sure, in this case, Ghostbusters Afterlife had a good, or even great, reason for taking this approach, but that really doesn't explain why most of the other comedies of its time also do that as well. Or to go in the opposite direction, take a movie like The Favorite. Now listen, you can love the movie if you want to, but I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say that this film perfectly represents absolutely everything wrong with cinema today. And look, I'm no movie expert. This movie can be made wonderfully in every technical regard for all I know. But the story is absolutely horrible. It serves no other purpose but to be as gross and degenerate as possible. And I know many others, were not amused by it. It would be one thing if it were at least trying to say something with that approach. But in the end, it ultimately amounts to nothing and is simply disgusting and horrible just for disgusting and horrible's sake. I am just glad it didn't win Best Picture because, and again, this is just my opinion, but this movie did not deserve it. I don't even think it would deserve to be nominated. But anyway, what really annoys me about it is that the director described it as, quote, it's just like All About Eve, but 100 times funnier. And it's just like, no. Just no. Because first of all, this movie is not funny to a lot of people, and that is simply a fact. Its humor is of a extremely subjective nature, so a statement like that is simply not accurate. And second of all, this movie is nowhere near the mastery of All About Eve. Not even close. Frankly, the fact that he thinks he can even compare this gross out to one of the most famous and beloved movies of the golden age of Hollywood almost offends me. Because here's the thing. Comedies of the golden age of Hollywood had to be funny if they wanted people to go and see them. They couldn't lean on profanity, gross out gags, or toilet humor to get by on. No. Because of the strict censorship of that era in both movies and TV, most comedies had to be completely clean. Sure, there were still black comedies and moments of dark humor, but it was much more spaced out, used sparingly, and well done. But the point is, a lot of comedies had to rely heavily on extremely talented comedians and joke writers in order to be successful. And as a result, many movies from the golden age of Hollywood can be watched today and still be considered funny, because their humor had a very universal appeal. Such comedians as the Marx Brothers, Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, Bob Hope, W.C. Fields, Red Skelton, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Lucille Ball, Jerry Lewis, and countless others I'm sure I'm forgetting. They're all still remembered, beloved, and hailed as some of the best comedians to have ever lived. And what did they all have in common? Their humor was almost completely clean. Their jokes contained no vulgarity or gross out humor. They were just simply funny to watch. And again, that's why they're so liked and famous even to this day, because they were just as funny back then as they are now. And they didn't need to rely on black comedy, disgusting gags, or excessive swearing in order to achieve that. They were simply trying to entertain an audience and make them laugh. Nothing more. And they've still been doing that job long after they've left this earth. And that's what's really impressive about it. Now, of course, one could argue that with actors and gag writers having to tell clean jokes for almost 50 years straight, it kind of made sense that once the censorships relaxed, that they would start leaning more into lowbrow humor, at first because it was a novelty, and then because most of the cleaner, G-rated jokes had long been taken. And there is some truth in that. I could imagine it being pretty hard for a joke writer to write an entire movie of new and original G-rated gags in this day and age. But the thing is, there are some that still do it. All the time, as a matter of fact. In kids' shows and movies. Now, obviously, profanity aside, kids' entertainment does sometimes rely on gross-out humor, and way too much on occasion at that, as well as indulge in some fairly black comedy at times. But on the whole, it's really impressive how these writers can still make their material really funny while still using almost completely clean humor. I mean, take a show like SpongeBob SquarePants, one of the most influential cartoons of the new millennium, and also coming out a staggering 70 years after sound comedy first came out in movies. This show managed to make both kids and adults laugh hysterically and create an animated icon that's right up there with the classic characters. Now once again, The show does have its more lowbrow moments, yes, but quite a few of its most famous and iconic bits are the cleanest jokes you can possibly come across, and the same applies to many other good shows and movies aimed at kids. Even Pixar had a particular knack for being funny in the most G-rated ways in their heyday. Now, what's my point with all of this? That the writers of comedies are obviously still capable of making clean comedy, but are instead choosing to lean into the black, morbid, and disgusting more and more. Now, why this is, I honestly have no idea, especially when it comes to whether the audience is encouraging this push or not. I mean, maybe all the black comedy is just something that the audience wants, and the writers are simply giving it to them. But I don't really know if that's the case. I mean, the whole point of comedy is to make people laugh and feel better. And while everybody does like darker humor on occasion, I'd have to imagine that it's good old-fashioned type comedy that does the best job of cheering an audience up. And really, maybe that's what people are forgetting. That comedy is supposed to make people feel better about their lives, not worse. And the fact that all those comedians I'd previously spoken about still have an appeal today only backs this point up. People enjoy comedy because it cheers them up and makes them feel better. But if black humor is too overused, like it arguably is nowadays, then it might just end up having the opposite effect on them and completely go against why we all watch comedies in the first place. Okay, I think that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that modern comedies have started relying too much on disgusting and black humor? Or do you love the direction comedy has been going in and that there's nothing wrong with it? Please let me know in the comments. And as I've already stressed multiple times, you don't have to agree with anything I said in this video. As I noted before, comedy is extremely subjective, and what doesn't appeal to one person can most definitely appeal to another. So if you think I was wrong about everything I said, that's fine. I'm always willing to accept your opinions as long as you are willing to accept mine and everybody else's. And thank you all for watching. I really greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.